The wagon wheels ground to a halt in front of the forge at high noon, and Susan Rhodes climbed down before the dust had even settled. A leather satchel clutched against her chest like it held her very heartbeat inside. Cecil Ellsworth looked up from the plank he was measuring, hammer still in hand, sweat cutting clean lines through the dust on his forearms. He had been in Silver Creek, Nevada for 3 weeks now, working the frame of what he intended to be the finest covered bridge in Lyon County. And for 3 weeks he had believed, with the same certainty a man believes the sun will rise, that the 200 acres behind him belonged to him free and clear. "You are standing on my land, ma'am," he said, not unkindly, but firm the way a man speaks when he has said something 100 times and expects to say it 100 more. "I am standing on my land, Mr. Ellsworth." Susan pulled a folded paper from the satchel and held it out at arm's length, not stepping closer, as though she did not yet trust the ground between them. "My father's deed, recorded in Virginia City in the year 1868. Emmett Rhodes. This ranch, the well, and the forge building beside it, passed to his only living daughter upon his death this past spring." Cecil set down the hammer. The heat of July pressed against his neck like a hand, and somewhere behind the barn a horse stamped and complained about the same heat, about the flies it stirred, about the low water in the trough. He walked toward her slowly, the way he might approach a spooked colt, and took the paper only after she offered it a second time. He read it twice. The seal was real. The signature at the bottom belonged to Judge Wexler Adair, and the ink had not been altered, not that Cecil could see, and Cecil had learned long ago on rail lines from Sacramento to Cheyenne how to spot a forged bill of sale. This was no forgery. This was a woman standing in the sun holding proof that the ground beneath his half-built bridge, his forge, his 6 months of saved wages, all of it, was not his. "I bought this parcel from a man named Josiah Pratt," Cecil said slowly. "Signed papers in Reno, paid him in gold." "Then Josiah Pratt sold you land that was never his to sell," Susan answered, and there was no cruelty in her voice, only a terrible, patient certainty. "My father owned this claim 11 years before he died. Mr. Pratt was his neighbor, and I am told, not an honest one." The name Pratt sat between them like a struck match. Cecil had heard the name before, always spoken low, always followed by a glance toward the ridge where the Camrose family kept their sprawling house above the mill. Josiah Pratt did small errands for Duncan Camrose, the man who owned the only stamp mill within 40 miles, the man who controlled the one road down to the rail spur, the man whose word carried more weight in Judge Adair's courtroom than any deed on paper. Cecil did not yet understand how deep that root ran, but standing there with the folded paper trembling slightly in Susan Rhodes's hand, he understood enough to feel the ground shift beneath him, quite literally, for the second time that day. "I need somewhere to open my shop," Susan said into the silence. "I'm a seamstress, Mr. Ellsworth, a good one, and I intend to build a business here, on my father's land, exactly as he would have wanted. I did not travel 200 miles by stage and wagon to be turned away by a man standing on a bridge he does not own." Cecil looked at the bridge frame behind him, half its beams raised, the mortise joints cut clean and true, 6 months of his life driven into that wood like nails. He looked at the forge building, cold and dark, where he had planned to set up a proper smithy once the bridge was finished, so Silver Creek would have both a crossing and a blacksmith of its own. He looked finally at Susan Rhodes, and saw not an enemy but a woman with tired eyes and a paper that could undo him, and something in his chest, something stubborn and honest, told him the fight was not with her. "I will not fight a lady over a deed I cannot disprove," he said at last. "But I will not walk away from 6 months of work on the say-so of a stranger's paper, either. Not until I understand how a man in Reno sold me ground he never owned." "Then we understand each other," Susan said. "For now." She did not smile, but something in her shoulders eased just slightly, the way a person eases when a threatened blow does not fall. That night Cecil walked the 2 miles into town under a sky bruised orange with the last of the heat, and he asked the questions he should have asked 6 months before. He found Josiah Pratt was gone, vanished east 3 weeks past. The same week, Cecil realized with a cold drop in his stomach that Emmett Rhodes had died, and his daughter had begun the long journey west to claim what was hers. He found the land office clerk would not meet his eyes when he asked about the original filing. He found, standing at the bar of the Bonanza Saloon with a glass he did not drink, that every man in town who spoke of the Camrose family lowered his voice first, and every man who lowered his voice looked, however briefly, toward the ridge. Silver Creek in the summer of 1878 was a town built on thirst. One road ran down from the mountains to the rail spur at Wabasca, and every wagon of ore, every barrel of water hauled up from the creek before it ran too low, every man's wages, passed one way or another through Duncan Camrose's mill. The well behind the mercantile had dropped 2 feet in a month. Tempers had dropped further. And into that dry, brittle summer, Susan Rhodes had arrived with a deed that named her the rightful owner of ground the Camrose family had quietly, patiently, been maneuvering to control for the better part of 2 years. Cecil did not know all of that yet. He knew only that he had built something true on ground that was not his, and that the woman who owned it had not screamed at him or threatened him with a rifle, as another might have. She had simply told him the truth and waited to see what kind of man he was. He intended to be the kind worth waiting for. The next morning Susan set up a table beneath the cottonwood tree beside the forge, laid out her needles and thread and bolts of cloth she had carried across 200 miles of rutted road, and began, in full view of the town, to sew. Word travels fast in a small place starved for anything new, and by the second day 3 women from town had walked out to see the strangers work with their own eyes. Susan measured a shoulder seam for the widow Halloran with hands that did not shake despite the heat, matched a bolt of blue calico to a customer's coloring without a moment's hesitation, and quoted a price fair enough that the woman paid it without haggling. Cecil, working the bridge joints 30 yards away, found his eyes drifting to the cottonwood tree more often than his work should have allowed. "You watch her like a man watches weather coming in," said Amos Teague, an older carpenter Cecil had hired on to help with the bridge, a man with 40 years of frontier work in his hands and very little patience for foolishness. "I'm making sure she does not steal my forge boards," Cecil said, which was a lie so poor even he did not believe it. Amos only grunted and went back to his saw, but he was smiling, and Cecil pretended not to notice. By the end of that first week, Susan had 6 customers and a growing reputation, and Cecil had made a decision. He rode to Dayton, the county seat, to search the original land records himself rather than trust the word of a Silver Creek clerk who flinched at the mention of Camrose. What he found there, in a dusty ledger book kept by a clerk more interested in his lunch than his duty, confirmed everything Susan had told him and worse. Emmett Rhodes's original claim had been recorded properly in 1868. Sometime in the past year, a second filing had appeared, backdated with a clumsy hand, granting the same parcel to Josiah Pratt. The forgery was sloppy enough that Cecil, no lawyer but no fool either, could see the ink was too fresh for a date 8 years gone. He rode back to Silver Creek with that knowledge sitting heavy in his saddlebag, and he found Susan at her table beneath the cottonwood, packing away her needles as the light went gold and long across the yard. "The second filing is a forgery," he said, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Recorded within the year, though it claims to be 8 years old." "I saw the book myself." Susan went very still. "Who recorded it? The name on the filing is Josiah Pratt's. But the hand that wrote it was paid for by someone with more to gain than a man who has already run off east with whatever coin he was given." Cecil did not say the name Camrose. He did not need to. Susan's face told him she had already guessed it, had perhaps known it since before she left Virginia City, had simply been waiting to see if the frontier carpenter would arrive at the truth on his own rather than have it handed to him. "My father wrote to me twice in the months before he died," she said quietly, folding a length of cloth with more care than the moment required, the way hands seek small tasks when hearts need steadying. He said a man named Camrose had offered to buy the ranch 3 times, and 3 times he refused. The last letter said he feared what refusing a 4th time might cost him. Your father died of what cause? A fall from his horse. Alone, on a trail he had ridden 1,000 times before. Susan looked up, and there were no tears in her eyes, only a hard, clear anger banked low like coals. I do not believe it was an accident, Mr. Ellsworth, though I have no proof, and a woman without proof in a county run by Duncan Camrose's judge is a woman who will be laughed out of any courtroom that would hear her. Cecil felt something cold settle into his chest. The particular cold of a man realizing the danger around him is larger than he first understood. He had come to Silver Creek to build a bridge, to put down roots after 11 years of railroad camps and timber towns, and a life spent always moving on before anything could hold him. He had not come looking for a fight against a man who owned a judge. But the fight had found him anyway, arriving on a wagon with a folded deed and a woman whose courage put his own caution to shame. Then we will need proof, he said, and we will need it before Camrose learns you mean to fight him rather than simply live quietly on land he wants. He already knows, Susan said. Men have been watching this ranch since the day I arrived. I have seen a rider on the ridge 3 mornings running, always before dawn, always gone by full light. Cecil had seen the rider too, and had told himself it was nothing. That night he moved his bedroll from the half-finished bridge to the forge building itself, close enough to hear if trouble came calling, and told himself it was only prudent, a builder protecting his materials, nothing more. Susan did not object, though she must have understood exactly what it meant. A man choosing to sleep within earshot of a woman he had known for barely a week. In a town starved for water and short on trust, such things were noticed and such things mattered, but neither of them spoke of it, and both of them slept a little easier for the other's nearness. The heat did not break that week, nor the next. The well behind the mercantile went from low to nearly dry, and the town council, such as it was, 3 merchants and the reverend meeting in the back of the feed store, argued for 2 hours over whether to ration water from the creek. Duncan Camrose did not attend such meetings. He did not need to. His mill used the creek water first, upstream of the town, and what reached Silver Creek's wells afterward was whatever he chose to leave behind. It was into this dry, short-tempered atmosphere that Susan Rhodes made her boldest move yet. And it began, as many bold things do, with an insult she refused to swallow. The widow Halloran's grandson worked at the Camrose mill, and through him word passed that Duncan Camrose himself had laughed when he heard a seamstress was setting up shop on the Rhodes ranch, calling her, according to the boy, a foolish woman playing at a man's inheritance who would fold within the month once the heat and the loneliness wore her down. The insult reached Susan by way of 3 separate mouths before the day was out, each retelling a little more colorful than the last, but the sting at the center of it did not need embellishing. Susan did not rage. She did something far more dangerous to a man like Duncan Camrose. She got to work. She rode into town the next morning, found the widow Halloran and 2 other women who had already become her customers, and asked them a question that would have sounded absurd from anyone else. Would they help her open a proper dress shop on Main Street within the month, not out at the ranch where only the curious would venture, but right in the heart of Silver Creek, where every woman in the district would pass it on her way to the mercantile? There is an empty building beside the assay office, said Mrs. Halloran, a stout woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions. Belonged to a saddler who went bust 2 winters back. Camrose owns the note on it, I believe, same as he owns notes on half the buildings in town. Then I will ask him to sell it to me, Susan said, or rent it and let him refuse a paying customer in front of the whole town if he dares. It was a shrewd move, and Cecil, hearing of it that evening from Amos Teague, who had heard it from his wife, who had heard it from Mrs. Halloran directly, felt a surge of something close to pride, an odd feeling to have for a woman he had known only a fortnight, and yet there it was, warm and unfamiliar and impossible to deny. Susan's request to rent the empty building was refused within a day politely, by a clerk who would not meet her eyes, the same clerk who managed several of Camrose's properties. But Susan had not truly expected to win that request. She had expected exactly what happened next, which was that half the women in town, already grumbling about the water rationing and the mill's endless demands, took note of a young widow's daughter being denied a simple lease for no reason anyone could name, and grumbled a little louder. "You are building an army out of seamstresses and gossip," Cecil told her one evening, watching her mend a torn seam by lamplight at the forge table, her needle moving with a quickness that still amazed him each time he watched it. "I am building the only army available to a woman with no gun and no vote," Susan answered without looking up. "Duncan Camrose understands force and money. He does not yet understand that a town full of women who trust me is worth more than either." "I do not doubt it," Cecil said, and meant it fully, and something in the way he said it made Susan finally look up from her sewing, needle stilled, her eyes meeting his across the lamplight in a way that lasted a moment too long to be simple conversation. "You are the first man in this district who has said that to me and meant it," she said quietly. "Then every man before me was a fool," Cecil said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, thick with a feeling he had not planned to voice. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the forge silent around them, the lamp guttering low, the whole dry world outside pressing in against the small, warm space between them. It was Susan who looked away first, back to her sewing, though her hands were not quite steady when she picked the needle back up. "You should sleep, Mr. Ellsworth. Tomorrow you go back to your bridge, and I go back to convincing this town that I am not the fool Duncan Camrose believes me to be." "Cecil," he said, "you may call me Cecil, given that we are apparently at war together." A small smile touched her mouth, the first he had truly seen from her, small and reluctant, and utterly transforming her tired face into something he wanted very much to see again. "Cecil, then, and you may call me Susan." It was such a small thing, the trading of first names, and yet it felt to both of them like the crossing of some invisible line, a line that once crossed could not easily be uncrossed. The days that followed brought escalation on every front. Cecil, working the bridge with Amos and two hired hands, found his tools scattered one morning, a support beam split clean through in the night by someone who knew exactly where to strike an axe to do the most damage without being seen. No one had heard anything, no one had seen anyone, and the message could not have been clearer if Duncan Camrose had signed his name to it. "They mean to slow the bridge," Amos said grimly, examining the ruined beam. "A bridge means the town does not need the toll road through Camrose land to reach the rail spur. A bridge means folks can cross the gorge on the north side instead of paying his toll gate." Cecil had known, distantly, that his bridge would eventually offer an alternative route around the toll gate Camrose operated at the gorge crossing, a gate that charged every ore wagon and every family a fee to pass, a fee that lined Camrose's pockets on top of everything else the mill already brought him. He had not fully understood, until that ruined beam lay before him in the dawn light, that his bridge was not merely a builder's dream of putting down roots. It was a direct threat to the very foundation of Camrose's control over the district. "They will come again," Cecil said. "Harder next time." He was right, though the next attack did not come against the bridge at all, but against Susan. It happened on a Thursday, hot and windless, the kind of day when even the flies seemed too tired to move. Susan was walking back from town toward the ranch, having spent the afternoon fitting a dress for Mrs. Halloran's daughter, when two riders fell in behind her on the road, close enough that their horse's breath was hot on her back, saying nothing at first, only riding, letting the silence and the nearness do the threatening for them. Susan did not run. She had grown up on a ranch, had spent her childhood around horses and men who thought a woman alone was a woman to be tested, and she knew that running only invited a chase. Instead, she stopped, turned, and looked the two riders full in the face, memorizing every detail she could: the scar on one man's jaw, the missing button on the other's vest, the brand on both their horses, a C inside a circle, the Camrose mark. "You are a long way from the mill," she said, her voice steadier than her heart. "Mr. Camrose thought you might like some company on the road," said the man with the scar. "Lonely thing, walking out here all by yourself. A woman ought to have someone looking after her." "I have someone looking after me," Susan said, though at that moment no one was in sight but empty road and dry hills. "And I have a memory for faces, gentlemen, and a memory for brands. Tell Mr. Camrose that if he wishes to speak with me, he is welcome to do so himself, in daylight, rather than sending men to frighten a woman on an empty road. It reflects poorly on him, and I suspect he cares a great deal about how he is reflected." It was a bluff, or nearly one, but it landed. The scarred man's eyes flickered, uncertain, unused to a target that did not flinch, and after a long moment of held breath, the two riders wheeled their horses and rode off toward the mill, leaving Susan alone on the road with her heart pounding and her knees, once they had gone, finally allowed to shake. She did not tell Cecil that night. She told herself it was because he had enough to worry over with the bridge. But the truth, which she admitted to herself only in the dark of her small room at the ranch house, was that she did not want to see fear on his face, did not want to give him one more reason to feel responsible for her, when she had spent her whole life proving she needed no man's protection. But Mrs. Halloran had a grandson who worked at the mill, and mill gossip traveled faster than Susan's silence, and within 2 days Cecil knew every detail of the encounter, embellished slightly in the retelling but true enough in its bones to turn his blood cold. He found her at her sewing table beneath the cottonwood, and for once his careful, measured manner deserted him entirely. "You were followed on the road and you said nothing to me." Susan set down her needle, unsurprised, having expected this conversation since the moment she learned Mrs. Halloran's grandson had a loose tongue. "I handled it, Cecil. That is not the point. It is entirely the point." Susan stood, and though she was a head shorter than him, she did not step back, did not yield an inch of ground, meeting his anger with a calm that only seemed to frustrate him further. "I did not come 200 miles to become a woman who runs to a man every time trouble finds her. I handled 2 riders on an empty road with words instead of a gun, and I would handle it the same way again." "I am not asking you to be helpless," Cecil said, his voice lower now, the anger burning down into something rower and harder to name. "I am asking you to let me know when you are in danger, because I cannot protect what I do not know is threatened, and I find, Susan, that I very much wish to protect you, whether you believe you need it or not." The words hung between them in the hot afternoon air, more honest than either of them had intended to be, and Susan felt something in her chest crack open, some wall she had built carefully over years of managing alone, first as a girl helping her widowed father run a ranch, then as a young woman building a trade in towns that did not always welcome an unmarried seamstress with opinions of her own. "I am not accustomed to anyone wishing to protect me," she said quietly. "My father tried in his way, but he is gone, and before him there was no one." "There is someone now," Cecil said, and the simplicity of it, the plainness, undid her more than any grand declaration could have. She did not step into his arms, not then, though every instinct in her body wanted to. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, just his hand, calloused and warm and steady, and held it for a long moment beneath the cottonwood tree while the heat pressed down around them and the whole dry world seemed, for once, to hold its breath along with them. "Thank you," she said, "for caring enough to be angry." "Always," Cecil said, and it was a promise neither of them fully understood the weight of yet, though both would come to understand it soon enough. The dress shop question resolved itself 2 weeks later in a way neither of them expected. The saddler's building beside the assay office, The one Camrose had refused to rent to Susan, burned in the night, a fire the sheriff called an accident from an overturned lamp, though the building had stood empty and unlit for 2 years. In the wake of the fire, the assay office owner, a nervous man named Wilbur Stanton who had grown tired of Camrose's growing shadow over every transaction in town, quietly offered Susan the use of a back room in his own building, rent-free, in exchange for nothing more than her discretion about the arrangement. "He is afraid," Susan told Cecil, "but not so afraid that he will not do the right thing when no one is watching." "That describes half this town," Cecil said. "Afraid but decent underneath it. Camrose has been counting on the fear lasting longer than the decency. Then we shall have to prove him wrong." Susan's shop, modest as it was, opened within the week, and something shifted in Silver Creek's mood the moment the sign went up. It was a small thing, a hand-painted board reading Rhodes' dressmaking in careful letters, but it stood as a kind of quiet defiance that the whole town could see whenever they walked past the assay office, and more than one person, passing it, felt their own courage stiffen a little in response. Customers came steadily now, not only for dresses but for mending, for alterations, for the simple pleasure of sitting in Susan's back room and talking while her needle flew. And in that talking, Susan learned things no amount of investigating could have uncovered on her own. She learned that Judge Adair owed Camrose money from a bad investment in a played-out silver claim 2 years back. She learned that the sheriff's deputy, a young man named Fletcher Combs, hated his job enforcing Camrose's will and had said as much, drunk, to his cousin, who happened to be the mercantile owner's wife, who happened to mention it to Susan while getting a hem fixed. She learned that Josiah Pratt had a sister in Carson City who might know where he had gone and might, for the right persuasion, be willing to say so. Each piece was small. Together they were beginning to form something like a case. Cecil, meanwhile, faced a different kind of siege. The bridge, slowed by the split beam and further sabotage, a stolen crate of nails here, a fouled well there, still crept toward completion through sheer stubbornness, and the steady, unglamorous labor of men who believed in what they were building. Amos Teague proved himself not only a skilled carpenter but a fierce ally, sitting up 2 nights running with a shotgun across his knees to guard the lumber stores after the split beam incident. And the 2 hired hands, brothers named Whitfield, stayed on despite Camrose's clumsy attempts to buy their loyalty away with promises of mill work at double wages. "We know what he is," the elder Whitfield brother told Cecil when Cecil, feeling responsible for the danger his crew now faced, offered to release them from their contracts without hard feelings. "We have watched him squeeze this town dry for 2 years. A man building a free bridge across that gorge is worth more to us than any wage Camrose could offer, because a bridge cannot be taken back once it is built. It just stands there, being useful for everyone forever." It was, Cecil thought, about the finest description of what he was trying to do with his life that anyone had ever offered him, and he found himself thinking of it often in the weeks that followed, particularly on the evenings when he sat with Susan beneath the cottonwood tree and spoke, haltingly at first, and then more freely, of the 11 years he had spent building things that other men would use and then move on from, never staying long enough to see how his bridges and buildings shaped the lives of the people who crossed and inhabited them. "I have built 4 bridges before this one," he told her one evening, the heat finally beginning to loosen its grip as the sun sank low and gold over the western hills. "Sacramento, then a rail trestle outside Elko, then 2 smaller crossings I have half forgotten the names of towns for. I always told myself I would settle somewhere eventually, once I found ground worth staying for." "And is this ground worth staying for?" Susan asked, and there was a carefulness in the question, a testing of water she was not certain she wanted the temperature of. "It is now," Cecil said simply, and did not elaborate, though the way he looked at her when he said it left little doubt that the ground he meant was not entirely a matter of soil and timber. Susan felt her breath catch, and for a moment the old fear rose in her, the fear that had kept her alone and self-sufficient for so many years, the fear that wanting something meant risking the terrible pain of losing it. Her mother had died when Susan was 12, her father this past spring, and every person she had ever allowed herself to lean on had eventually been taken from her by time or distance or death. To let herself want Cecil Ellsworth, to let herself hope for a future built alongside him rather than one fought for entirely alone, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with the wind pushing at her back. "I have spent so long believing I must do everything myself," she admitted, the words coming slow and hard-won. "That wanting help, wanting anyone, was a weakness I could not afford." "It is not weakness to want someone beside you," Cecil said. "I built 4 bridges alone, in the sense that I never let anyone matter enough to miss when I moved on. I do not think that made me strong, Susan. I think it only made me lonely, and called the loneliness independence because the word sounded better." Susan reached for his hand again, as she had once before beneath this same tree, and this time she did not let go after a moment. This time she held it as the sun went down fully behind the hills, and the two of them sat together in a silence that said more than either of their careful words had managed. A silence full of things neither was yet ready to name aloud, but both were beginning, unmistakably, to feel. The midpoint reversal, when it came, arrived not through Camrose's design but through simple bad luck compounded by the season's cruel dryness, and it changed everything about how the fight would have to be fought. It began at the mill itself, high on the ridge above town, where an overloaded ore cart, its brake worn thin by months of heavy use and no maintenance because Camrose had been cutting corners on safety to save money during the drought, broke free on the steep grade above the processing yard. The cart, laden with several tons of raw ore, began its run just after dawn, gathering speed down the mountain track that led, as all such tracks did in that district, directly toward the cluster of workers' cabins and the small schoolhouse at the base of the grade, where at that hour a dozen mill children would already be gathering for lessons before the day's heat became unbearable. Cecil was working the final span of the bridge, a half-mile from the mill grade but close enough that the mountain sound carried on the still morning air, when he heard the shriek of metal on metal and the shouts of alarm rising up from the mill yard. He knew, in the way that a man who has spent his life around heavy machinery and rail lines knows, exactly what that sound meant. "Runaway cart," he said to Amos, already moving, "on the school grade." He did not wait for Amos's response. He ran. The distance was half a mile of rough ground, and Cecil covered it faster than he had run anything in years, his lungs burning in the thin, dry heat, his mind fixed on a single image: the schoolhouse at the bottom of that grade and the children who would be walking toward it at this very hour, satchels in hand, unaware of the several tons of steel and stone bearing down on them with no brake to stop it. He reached the grade in time to see the cart already halfway down, gathering terrible speed, sparks flying where its wheels ground against the rusted rail, and below, at the base of the grade, he could see small figures, children, converging toward the schoolhouse door, none of them yet aware of the danger rushing toward them. There was no time to reach the schoolhouse and warn them directly. The cart would arrive before he could cover the distance. Cecil's mind, trained by years of rail work, went instead to the track itself, to the switch point he had noticed weeks before while surveying the grade for bridge timber, a manual switch that could divert the cart onto a spur line that dead-ended in a gravel bank 50 yards short of the schoolhouse, a spur used for dumping waste rock, currently empty. The switch lay directly in the cart's path, close enough to the thundering wheels that throwing it would mean standing on the very track the cart was hurtling down until the last possible second. Cecil did not hesitate. He had spent 11 years learning exactly this kind of calculation, the precise, unforgiving mathematics of speed and distance, and the narrow window in which a man might act before catastrophe became certain rather than merely possible. He sprinted the last stretch to the switch stand, threw his full weight against the lever, felt it stick, rusted from disuse and the summer's brutal dryness, and threw himself against it a second time with a strength born of pure desperate necessity as the cart's shadow fell across him, and its wheels screamed not 20 yards distant. The switch gave. The rails shifted with a groan of metal. Cecil flung himself sideways off the track bed, rolling hard into the gravel embankment, as the runaway cart roared past him along its new diverted path, thundering onto the dead-end spur and slamming into the gravel bank in an explosion of dust and shattered timber, and flying ore that Cecil felt as much as heard, a concussion of sound and force that left his ears ringing and his whole body shaking with the aftermath. Below, at the schoolhouse, the children had stopped, frozen, staring up the grade at the cloud of dust where the cart had met the gravel bank, utterly unaware how close they had come to disaster, how narrow the margin had been between an ordinary morning and a tragedy that would have marked the whole district for a generation. Cecil lay in the gravel for a long moment, breathing hard, before he became aware of Amos Teague's voice shouting his name from up the grade, and of the mill workers who had begun to run down from the yard above, and of the strange, ringing silence in his own head that came from having stared death in the face and walked, bruised but whole, away from it. Word of what Cecil had done reached Susan within the hour, and she was at his side before the mill's own doctor had finished examining the cuts and bruises along his arm and shoulder, her face white with a fear she made no attempt to hide, all her careful composure momentarily abandoned. "You could have died," she said, her hands hovering over him as though afraid to touch and afraid not to. "You could have been crushed, Cecil, and for what? A company's ore cart that Camrose himself let fall into disrepair." "For the children at the schoolhouse," Cecil said, wincing as the doctor rapped his shoulder. "There was no one else close enough to reach the switch in time." Susan's fear did not fade, but something else moved through it, a fierce and sudden pride that she did not try to hide either, and she took his uninjured hand in both of hers and held it as though she meant never to let it go. "You are the bravest fool I have ever known," she said, half laughing, half crying, the words tumbling out with none of her usual careful control. "I am told that is a family trait among people who build bridges," Cecil said, and the small joke, weak as it was, made Susan laugh outright despite the tears standing in her eyes, and in that laugh, in that moment of terror giving way to relief, giving way to something warmer still, they both understood, without either needing to say it aloud, that whatever had been growing between them in careful, cautious steps had just leapt forward into something neither of them could pretend was merely friendship anymore. But the runaway cart, for all its danger, had also handed them their first real weapon against Duncan Camrose, because a full investigation into the accident, demanded loudly by furious mill workers whose own children had nearly died, revealed that Camrose had known the brake mechanisms on 3 of his ore carts were failing, and had ordered his foreman to keep them running anyway rather than halt production during the drought and lose a single day's shipment. The foreman, a man named Otis Vance, terrified of being made the sole scapegoat for a near tragedy that would have killed a dozen children, was persuaded, after a long night's conversation with Cecil and the mill worker's own informal spokesman, to put his knowledge into a signed statement. "This alone will not bring down a man like Camrose," Cecil said, showing the statement to Susan 2 days later at her shop, his shoulder still bandaged but his spirit considerably lighter. "But it is a crack in the wall. The town has seen, with their own eyes, what his corner cutting nearly cost them." "It is more than a crack," Susan said, studying the statement with the sharp attention she brought to everything. "It is proof that Duncan Camrose values his profits over the lives of the very families who work his mill. Combine that with what I have learned about the forged deed and about Judge Adair's debts, and we may have enough to bring this before someone other than Adair's own courtroom." "The circuit judge," Cecil said, understanding. "He rides through Dayton twice a year to hear cases the local court cannot settle fairly. He is due through in 3 weeks," Susan said. "I learned as much from Mrs. Halloran, whose cousin clerks for the county. If we can gather enough evidence before then, enough witnesses willing to speak, we might bring this case before a Judge Camrose does not own." 3 weeks. It was not much time, but it was enough to work with, and both of them understood that the coming weeks would require every ally they could gather and every scrap of courage they could summon, because Duncan Camrose would not sit quietly while his empire was threatened, and a cornered man with as much to lose as Camrose stood to lose was a dangerous thing indeed. The gathering of evidence and allies fell largely to Susan, whose shop had become, without her quite planning it, the unofficial meeting place for every person in Silver Creek who harbored a grievance against the Camrose family, but had never before found a safe place to voice it. Mrs. Halloran's grandson, emboldened by the near tragedy at the schoolhouse, came forward with details of the falsified deed filing, having overheard 2 of Camrose's men discussing it weeks before while he swept the mill office. Wilbur Stanton, the assay office owner who had quietly offered Susan her shop space, finally found the courage to admit that Camrose had pressured him for years to undervalue certain claims so Camrose could buy them cheap from desperate prospectors, a practice that, laid alongside the forged deed and the ore cart negligence, painted a portrait of a man who had built his fortune on a foundation of quiet, systematic theft. Even Deputy Fletcher Combs, the young lawman who had confessed his distaste for enforcing Camrose's will, came to Susan's shop one evening after closing, hat in hand, nervous as a schoolboy, to offer what he could. "I have seen things I should have reported," he admitted. Men roughed up for falling behind on debts to the mill store. A miner's claim jumped with papers that came from Judge Adair's own office, backdated same as your ranch deed. I did not act because I was afraid of losing my position, and afraid of worse than that if I am honest. But I have watched Mr. Ellsworth stand in front of a runaway cart to save children he had never met, and I have watched you, Miss Rhodes, build a business out of nothing while men tried to burn you out and frighten you off the road. And I find I am more ashamed of my own silence than I am afraid of Duncan Camrose. It was, Susan reflected later, exactly the kind of courage that could not be bought or bullied out of existence, courage born from watching 2 people refuse to bend, and she understood, more clearly than ever, the truth of what she had told Cecil weeks before, that a town full of people who trusted each other was worth more than any single powerful man's fear-based hold over them. Cecil, meanwhile, faced the more physical dangers still lurking beyond the town's edges. With the bridge nearing completion, Camrose's sabotage grew bolder and more desperate. A fire was set at the lumber stores, caught early enough by Amos's night watch to be contained, but close enough to disaster that Cecil began sleeping at the bridge site itself most nights, exhausted but unwilling to leave his crew's safety to chance. It was during one such night, 3 days before the circuit judge was due to arrive, that the danger came to a head in a way that tested Cecil's resolve more severely than any sabotage had before. 2 riders came to the bridge site well after midnight, and Cecil, roused from a thin sleep by the sound of horses, emerged from his bedroll to find the scarred man Susan had once described to him, and another man Cecil did not recognize, sitting their horses in the moonlight at the edge of the construction yard. "Mr. Camrose sends his regards," the scarred man said, "and a warning. The bridge stands unfinished a while longer, or the woman finds her shop burned same as the saddler's building did. Your choice, carpenter, which one you would rather protect." Cecil felt a cold, clean anger settle over him, the kind that steadied rather than shook a man's hands. "You tell Duncan Camrose that I have stood in front of a runaway ore cart without flinching, and I do not flinch for men who threaten women from horseback in the dark either. Burn what you like. I will rebuild it. I have done so before, and every time I rebuild, this town remembers a little better exactly what kind of man you serve." The scarred rider studied him for a long moment, perhaps weighing whether the carpenter's calm was bluff or genuine resolve, and something in Cecil's steady stance must have convinced him it was the latter, because after a moment he wheeled his horse without another word and rode off into the dark, his companion following. Cecil did not sleep again that night. He rode instead at first light to Susan's shop to warn her of the threat, and found her already awake, already dressed. A shotgun her father had left her leaning within reach beside her sewing table, having heard from Mrs. Halloran's grandson, whose ear for mill gossip had proven invaluable, that Camrose men had ridden out toward the bridge in the night. "I am not defenseless," Susan said, seeing the worry on Cecil's face before he had spoken a word. "My father taught me to shoot before he taught me to sew. I would rather sew, but I have not forgotten how." "I do not doubt it," Cecil said, and found, looking at her standing firm in the morning light with her father's shotgun close at hand, that he had never admired anyone more in his life, nor loved anyone more fiercely, and the word love arrived in his thoughts with such sudden clarity that it startled him nearly as much as the night's threats had. He did not say it yet. There was too much danger still unresolved, too much uncertainty hanging over both their futures, for him to burden her with a declaration he was not yet certain he could follow through on if the fight against Camrose went badly. But he thought it, standing there in her shop with the morning heat already beginning to press down outside, and the thought settled into him with a permanence that felt, for the first time in his 11 years of wandering, entirely and finally like home. The confrontation that finally broke Duncan Camrose's grip on Silver Creek came not through violence, though violence had shadowed every step of the weeks leading toward it, but through the arrival of Judge Harmon Whitlock, the circuit judge, 3 days later than expected due to a washed-out crossing on the road from Dayton, a delay that Cecil spent those extra days dreading might give Camrose time to somehow forestall the whole confrontation entirely. He need not have worried. Susan had prepared too thoroughly and gathered too many voices for Camrose to silence them all in 3 days without drawing exactly the kind of attention he could least afford. The hearing was held in the largest space Silver Creek possessed, the feed store's back warehouse, cleared of grain sacks for the occasion, and it seemed to Cecil, standing at the rear of the crowded room with Susan beside him, that half the district had turned out to witness it, drawn by weeks of rumor and the schoolhouse near tragedy and a hunger, long suppressed, to see Duncan Camrose finally called to account. Judge Whitlock was a lean, gray-haired man with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics, and he moved through the proceedings with brisk efficiency, calling first for the land office records Cecil had examined in Dayton, comparing the ink and hand of the 2 competing filings with a magnifying glass he produced from his own coat pocket, and pronouncing, within minutes, that the Pratt filing showed clear signs of recent forgery disguised as an old document. A professional opinion that carried far more weight coming from an impartial circuit judge than it ever could have from Cecil alone. "The deed belongs to Susan Rhodes," Judge Whitlock declared. "Filed properly in good order, dated correctly and uncontested by any legitimate claim. The parcel including the ranch house, the forge building and all associated acreage is confirmed in her name, free and clear." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Susan's hand found Cecil's, gripping tight though her face remained composed, years of careful control holding even as her heart, Cecil could feel through her grip, pounded fast enough to match his own. But the judge was not finished. Deputy Combs's testimony regarding the pattern of falsified claims and debt-based intimidation, corroborated by Wilbur Stanton's account of pressured undervaluations, and further corroborated by Otis Vance's signed statement regarding the ore cart negligence that had so nearly killed a dozen schoolchildren, painted a portrait too consistent and too well documented for Judge Whitlock to dismiss as mere small-town grievance. Duncan Camrose, seated at the front of the room in a suit too fine for the dusty warehouse around him, rose to object, his face flushed with an anger he was clearly struggling to contain in front of so public an audience. This is a coordinated attack by a carpenter and a seamstress who covet what I have built through honest labor," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I built this mill from nothing. I brought jobs to this district when there was nothing here but empty hills." "You brought jobs," Judge Whitlock said, not unkindly but without any give in his tone either. "And you also, by the sworn testimony of your own foreman, knowingly operated equipment you understood to be dangerous, in a manner that nearly killed a dozen children, in order to protect your profits during a drought that has strained this entire district's water and patience alike. You also, by physical evidence I have examined myself, falsified a land claim to seize property from a widow's daughter who had every legal right to it. Whatever good you have done for this district, Mr. Camrose, does not erase the harm, and a court of law does not weigh one against the other as though they cancel out. I am ordering full restitution of the Rhodes property, a fine sufficient to fund proper safety repairs at the mill under independent inspection, and I am forwarding the forgery evidence to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office in Carson City for further action, which may well result in criminal charges." The warehouse erupted into a low roar of reaction, some shocked, some triumphant, and Susan, standing beside Cecil, finally allowed herself the smallest exhale of relief, though her eyes remained fixed on Camrose's face, watching the man's carefully cultivated authority crumble in real time before an entire town that had, for 2 years, been too afraid to imagine this exact moment possible. Camrose did not go quietly. In the chaos of the room emptying, he crossed toward Susan with a fury barely contained, his voice low enough that only she and Cecil, standing close, could hear it clearly. "You have made an enemy today that will follow you the rest of your life," he hissed. "This district remembers who built it and who tore it down for spite." "I did not tear anything down, Mr. Camrose," Susan said, her voice steady despite the venom in his. "I only asked for what was mine and told the truth when asked. If the truth has torn down what you built, then what you built was never sound to begin with." Cecil stepped forward then, not threateningly, but with a solid, immovable presence that made his meaning unmistakable without a single raised hand. "The judge has ruled, Camrose. Walk away, or I will walk you out myself, and I suspect this crowd would not lift a finger to stop me." Camrose looked between them, at the crowd gathering again at the edges of the room, drawn by the raised voices, at the deputy who had found, at last, the courage to step forward himself, and something in the calculation behind his eyes finally, visibly, broke. He turned without another word and walked out of the warehouse, and though he would remain in the district for some months afterward, selling off his mill holdings under the weight of the criminal investigation that followed, he never again held the power over Silver Creek that he had wielded for 2 dry, thirsty years. The crowd took a long while to disperse, everyone wanting to shake Susan's hand, or Cecil's, or simply to stand near the 2 people who had done what the whole town had been too afraid to attempt alone. Mrs. Halloran wept openly and embraced Susan with a fierceness that surprised them both. Amos Teague clapped Cecil on his uninjured shoulder hard enough to stagger him, grinning wider than Cecil had ever seen. Even Wilbur Stanton, usually so nervous and retiring, allowed himself a proud smile as he shook Cecil's hand and thanked Susan for giving him, as he put it, the courage he had been missing for years. It was nearly evening by the time the warehouse finally emptied, the summer sun beginning its long, slow descent toward the western hills, the heat at last loosening its brutal grip as it did every evening, promising a few hours of bearable coolness before the cycle began again the next day. Susan and Cecil found themselves alone at last, walking slowly back toward the ranch along the same road where, weeks before, 2 riders had once tried to frighten her into submission, a road that now felt, in the golden evening light, entirely different, entirely safe. "It is over," Susan said, as much to convince herself as to inform him, the words still strange in her mouth after weeks of fighting for exactly this outcome. The ranch is mine, truly mine, with no shadow hanging over it. It is over, Cecil agreed, and the bridge will be finished within the week, now that there is no one left with reason to slow it. They walked in silence for a while, the dry hills around them turning amber and rose in the fading light, the creek beside the road running low but running still, a small mercy after so hard a summer. "I have been thinking," Cecil said finally, "about what happens now. To the both of us, I mean. I came to this district to build a bridge and put down roots after years of never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. I have built the bridge, nearly. But I find the roots I have grown here are not in the ground at all, Susan. They are in you." Susan stopped walking and turned to face him fully, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears, the whole dry, beautiful evening seeming to hold its breath around them exactly as it had once before, beneath the cottonwood tree, on the night she first took his hand. "I came here to build a life that was entirely my own," she said, her voice not quite steady, "because every person I ever leaned on was eventually taken from me, and I could not bear to feel that helpless again. But I have watched you throw yourself in front of a runaway ore cart to save children you had never met. I have watched you stand firm against threats meant to frighten you off this land, and choose, every single time, to stay and fight rather than run. I do not think loving you would make me helpless, Cecil. I think it would make me exactly as strong as I have always tried to be, only no longer alone in the trying." "Then let me say it plainly," Cecil said, closing the last small distance between them, his hand coming up to gently cradle her face, careful and reverent as though she were something rare and precious, which to him she entirely was. "I love you, Susan Rhodes. Not for the deed you carried across 200 miles, and not for the fight you have won today, though I admire both beyond measure. I love you for the woman who judged me by my actions rather than my reputation, who saw a stranger claiming her land and chose to give him the chance to prove himself worthy of trust rather than simply driving him off. I love you for your courage, your skill, your stubborn refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are. I would like very much to spend the rest of my life building things beside you, if you will have me." Susan felt the tears she had held back through the entire tense hearing finally spill free, though these tears carried nothing but joy, and she reached up to cover his hand with her own where it rested against her cheek. "I love you too," she said, the words coming easier than she had ever imagined they might, all her old careful walls finally, willingly coming down. "I have loved you, I think, since the night you moved your bedroll to the forge to sleep within earshot of me and pretended it was only about protecting your materials. I would very much like to spend the rest of my life beside you as well, Cecil Ellsworth, building things and defending them and simply living together." He kissed her then, there on the dusty road in the last gold light of the day. The town had finally been set free, and it was not a hurried kiss, nor a hesitant one, but slow and certain, and full of every week of careful longing that had led them to exactly this moment. Two people who had each spent years believing they must stand alone, discovering instead the particular strength of standing, from now on, together. They were married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony held beneath the very cottonwood tree where Susan had first set up her sewing table, the bridge standing finished and proud in the near distance, its clean timber arch already carrying wagons and walkers across the gorge that had once required Camrose's toll gate to cross. Reverend Josiah Willett performed the ceremony, and half the town attended, Mrs. Halloran weeping through the whole affair, Amos Teague serving as Cecil's best man with evident pride, Wilbur Stanton and Deputy Combs standing among the witnesses who had once been too afraid to speak and now stood tall and unashamed in the daylight. Susan wore a dress of her own making, pale blue calico that matched, though she never told anyone this small private joke. The very first bolt of cloth she had matched to a customer's coloring beneath this same tree weeks before, when she had been a stranger fighting for a claim no one believed she could hold. Cecil wore a simple dark coat, his shoulder still faintly marked from the ore cart incident, a scar he would carry the rest of his life as quiet testament to the day everything between them had truly begun to change. The ranch house, restored and expanded with lumber from Cecil's own careful hands, became home to both the dressmaking business, which continued to grow as word spread through the county of the seamstress who had faced down Duncan Camrose and won, and to a small blacksmith operation Cecil finally opened in the forge building, teaching himself the trade alongside his carpentry, finding that a man who built bridges and a woman who built garments both understood in their own ways the deep satisfaction of making something durable and useful with one's own two hands. Duncan Camrose sold the last of his mill holdings within the year, the criminal investigation from Carson City having stripped away both his fortune and his standing, and left the district entirely, no one quite certain where he went, and no one, in truth, much caring. The mill itself passed to new ownership under stricter oversight, its ore carts properly maintained, its workers no longer living beneath the shadow of one man's greed. The well behind the mercantile, once the summer's brutal heat finally broke into the milder days of early autumn, began to recover, and Silver Creek settled at last into the kind of steady, ordinary life that Cecil had crossed 11 years of frontier town searching for, and that Susan had crossed 200 miles of rutted road determined to build for herself, neither of them realizing until they found each other that the life they sought had been waiting, all along, to be built by two people together rather than one person alone. On the evening after their wedding, once the last guests had finally departed down the road toward town, their laughter and well-wishes fading into the cooling dusk, Susan and Cecil stood together on the bridge itself, watching the last light drain from the sky over the gorge that had so recently been a battleground, and was now, simply, a crossing, a place where people passed safely from one side of their lives to the other. "Twice as skilled as any man who doubted me," Susan said, half to herself, remembering the sneers of the land office clerk, the dismissiveness of Camrose's men, the countless small insults she had weathered on her way to this moment. "That is what Mrs. Halloran told me last week, that half the county now says it of me, that the blacksmith's apprentice, as some have taken to calling me since I opened the forge alongside you, turned out twice as skilled as every man who doubted her." "You are more than twice as skilled as any of them," Cecil said, pulling her close against his side as the first stars began to emerge over the darkening hills. "You judged a man fairly when the whole district was ready to let fear and reputation decide everything for them. You built a business from nothing in a town that tried to burn you out. You gathered allies where I could only fight with my hands, and between the two of us we brought down a man who thought himself untouchable. I did not doubt you, Susan, not for one moment since that first day you handed me your father's deed and waited to see what kind of man I would be." "No," Susan said, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely safe. "You never did doubt me. That is why I loved you before I even understood I was falling." They stood together on the bridge a while longer, two people who had each traveled hard roads to arrive at exactly this quiet, hard-won peace, watching the stars multiply across the vast Nevada sky, the creek running steady beneath them, the town settling into its evening quiet behind them, and the whole wide future stretching out ahead, no longer something either of them needed to face alone. The road that had once required a toll gate now belonged to everyone. The land that had once been contested now belonged, without question, to Susan Rhodes and, through marriage, to the family she and Cecil Ellsworth were building together. And the love that had grown slowly, cautiously, between a woman who trusted only actions and a man who had learned, through her, exactly how to be trusted, stood now as permanent and as sound as the bridge beneath their feet, built to last, built to hold, built at last to stay.